Well, thank you, Lenny, and welcome hello, everybody. I just want to say before I start, it's really a privilege and an honor to speak with you today. Lenny, I just want to point out that I changed my talk a while ago. I was going to give the talk that you described, but after looking at the program and seeing how extensive it was, it seemed to me that that some of the points that I was going to make were already covered, and I thought, how could I really make a contribution that goes beyond, beyond another way to, to understand and forecast customers. And so what I decided to do instead was to talk about using listening to challenge the way that we think about our customers and our businesses and things, and it's a topic that we refer to as mental models. But and to jump into this, I want to actually pivot off something that Red said, which was when he talked about having a mental image of the supermarket. And and for most of us, when we go to the supermarket, things are pretty much in the same place all the time. And so if you say to somebody, go and pick out everything you need in 2 minutes, they can probably, find the things that are most important to them in those first 2 minutes. But what happens when the supermarket operator changes the store layout and doesn't tell you? Then what happens? When you get there, you're confused, you don't know what's going on. And in fact, this happens to me quite often because one of the places that I shop in Connecticut is called Stu Leonard's. And Stu Leonard's is known for changing the placement and location of foods, fruits, vegetables, milk, beverages, everything. And so every few months when I go there, it's like, what? How do I find this? Where am I? And sometimes I have to ask, like the stockers and the people who work there, where can I find the milk this week? So what I'm describing is that I would go to the store with one mental model, but then I'd get there, and I'd be presented with information that forced me to challenge and change my mental model so that I could shop effectively once again. And and when it comes to brands, right, one of the classics now is sort of what happened with Tropicana, because they changed their I'm sure everybody knows this. They changed their packaging, and actually, when I went to my supermarket, Stop and Shop, to just get the container of orange juice, I didn't know where it was. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that it was there anymore, because they changed the packaging in such a way that it just contradicted fully my mental model. So I just want to use that as a way of of getting into this. So. All right. And one way to do it is for all of us to construct our own mental model. Now, what you see on the screen is a Cognac Hennessy. And I just want to tell you some facts about it. And as I tell you them, I'd just like you to fix an image in your mind that is being described by this information. So one is that Hennessy Cognac it's older than the United States. This brand is more than 250 years old. It's based in Paris, drunk by aristocrats, kings. It's a very upscale brand. Here in the States, very much associated with clubs after dinner, cigars. To be drunk, just as you see here, right, in snifters without ice, which is called neat. And this is, and I just wanted to fix that in your mind because this is 250 years of Hennessy legacy. And now I'm going to give you some facts. Now, Hennessy has moved on to the web. And one of the things that Hennessy began to discover through a type of listening that I call behavioral listening is they were looking at the links that were coming into their website. And what they saw was that the links were coming from the web and that they were coming from a social network. So as I'm talking about this, thinking about what's going on in your mind. Then when they looked more deeply at the links, they saw that the links were predominantly coming from one social network called blackplanet.com. Black Planet is the largest social network for African Americans. Then when they did some additional research and looked to see how people were drinking cognac, what they discovered was that it wasn't being drunk like this. It wasn't being drunk neat in these really nice snifters. It was being mixed with juice and other liquors, soda, and these drinks were being given all kinds of funny and amusing names, some of which I really can't, I don't want to mention over the webinar. And so now what's happened to your mental model? You know, did you experience some sort of, you know, for a moment, like, what is going on? This isn't my brand, right? This isn't the customer that I thought we had. And so resolving that tension is what it means to really challenge your mental model. So what Hennessy did was they did some additional research. They did an ethnography. They did some surveys based upon their listening and so forth. And they eventually profiled this the African American social network customer. And what they determined was that they were high-value customers, that they were influential. They shared their information, but they liked to enjoy it with music and in clubs and in social situations. And so what Hennessy did is they said, well, at least for our web strategy, we're going to change it and reflect this new customer. And so what you see up here is just a little kind of a collage of the way that they present themselves on the web. And if you compare that to the image on the left, you can see it's extremely different. But what they were able to do was challenge their mental model, replace it with a new one, and act on it. And even the brands underneath it, those are 3 products they introduced against this new strategy that they developed. Now, I've presented this case a number of times, and a few months ago, I was presenting it to an advertising class at NYU, and when I got almost through it, one of the students said, "But Steve, do you know about Cristal champagne?" And I said, "No, tell me the story." So they said, well, Cristal was also picked up by, you know, the urban consumer and became very much a part of hip-hop culture, and it was celebrated in songs and things like that. But unlike Hennessy, when Cristal recognized this, they refused to change their mental model, and in fact, they started distancing themselves from hip-hop culture entirely. And the result is that instead of cultivating a market, they essentially rejected the market. And so Cristal is still sung about in songs, but negatively, not positively. And when I asked the students in the class, would you buy that beverage? And they said no, because, you know, they pulled away from us. And so this is really the power of mental models. It takes a lot of effort. It takes good argument and good data to change them. And it also takes a lot of guts and boldness. And this is really essential. But the point that I want to make now and through the rest of the presentation is that listening can help us change our mental models. But oftentimes, especially as marketers and advertisers, we're resistant to doing so. Okay. And the reason that I called my presentation Listening with the Third Ear is that it means to do what Hennessy did and what Cristal didn't. It means listening with all of our intelligences, all of our ways of knowing. And I wish that I had actually come up with that title, but I didn't. The title is over 50 years old. It comes from a book called Listening with the Third Ear, written by a psychoanalyst named Theodore Reich. And the point that he was making is that to be an effective psychoanalyst, and that's what he was really concerned about, is that you had to go beyond what you learned in school and your training to really go to tap your experience and your intuition. Now, as marketers, we use our intuition, but we can't rely on it entirely. And so I would say, in addition, it means using our experience and our ability to triangulate, to bring in different sources of information to bear so that when we challenge our mental model and we decide to change it, that there's support for doing so. In some ways, it's like, I'm sure all of you remember a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, about paradigm change. And the point that Kuhn makes is not that that the better idea simply wins out. The better idea wins out because there's lots of evidence to support the change, and and it becomes essentially a social process for progress in science. It's the same here. So listening has this ability to spark us to really challenge our mental models and think through ways of doing that. So, what happened? Okay. So other brands, now changing mental models is not something new. It's not just something that listening brings about. It's something that listening can help more of us do now. But when you go back in time, one of the brands that changed its mental model, and I was part of this back in the early 70s, was when Miller Lite changed its strategy from being a beer that was marketed to women to a beer marketed to men, especially heavy drinkers. Back then in the 70s, there was a time when marketers became very interested in developing strategies, especially for women. And so one of the classics was the creation of Virginia Slims cigarettes, for example. And so Miller thought, well, let's have a beer for women. And they came out with that light beer because it was going to be lower in calories, lower effect, and all of that. But I had the great experience of working with a really brilliant strategist at McCann at the time in the early 70s named Van Bortle. And what he recognized from the data, which is a form of listening, I call it behavioral listening, was to see that really this could appeal to men who are heavy drinkers who wanted the taste but didn't want to get filled up because they're drinking their beer with their buddies and over a period of time. And so he recommended, and Miller bought it, they changed the strategy. And that was really a huge change in mental model, and it really propelled the light beer category entirely. Later, almost, in 1989, Xerox changed its model from thinking themselves as a copier manufacturer and equipment maker to a document company. And so it pulled this sort of classic Ted Levitt, which is to think more about the benefit that you're providing than the actual thing that you're making. And then the classic one where listening has played a role is Old Spice, of course, where Old Spice had the realization to shift strategy from marketing their product to men, right, to marketing to women, because when they looked at purchasing data and they listened to conversations that women were having, it was about what they were buying for their men. And so Old Spice created a campaign and really changed its mental model about who the customer is. So it's not that mental models are new or that changing them is new. They've been around for a long time. Now we're better equipped to recognize them and to change them ourselves. So now what I want to do is just go through a few slides showing that the world that we live in and the mental models that we have that are dominant. So the world we live in today is one that, of course, we all know emphasizes speed, agility, quickness, all of that good stuff that we read in the management literature. Because when you can take a view on it that we live in a much more complex world, and we live. I love this phrase. We live on the age of chaos, and what we try to do with our companies is understand the change that's coming at us, but also being able to organize effectively so that we can continue to market our brands successfully through these changes. But the mental model that many of our companies still have is this one. It's still very much command and control. Let's wait and see. Let's evaluate. And it's one where we're not really tuned in to the environment as it's changing. We have an impression of the marketing environment that we'd like to be in. When it comes to consumers, we know that that we have to think about people in terms of their relationships, their communications, and their culture. But when it comes to understanding people, right, we're still doing analytic stuff. We're measuring what they do instead of understanding who they are. And this is a fairly common type of chart that you see when it comes to how people use social media. Instead of really asking the questions about what does social media mean to people, how do they really use how do they use it in terms in the context of their life, we're saying, well, they use portals for 2 minutes, and they use classified ads, and they download stuff. That's not really capturing what people are and who they are and what they do. When it comes to advertising, advertising has been changing from, to becoming more of a transmedia, cross-cultural effort. The classic here is the Audi Art of the Heist, which went across all media, including print and newspapers. So advertising is becoming, or has become, more engaging, more involving, and more experiential. And yet, when we talk about advertising and try to analyze advertising, we're still using old models that depend upon, learning and persuading. It's a very, we insist on bringing our old models of advertising to bear on, a very new reality. So, and even when it comes to listening, we know that people are using social tools. They're engaged not in two-way conversations, but in n-way conversations, all within a cultural fabric and context, yet most of the listening that we do is like this. It's two-way, and most of the listening that we do, when you look at the application, the most common use cases, it's all about customer service. So I've got a problem, let me solve it for you, and reputation management, where somebody has said something bad about you, and you want to turn that negative into a positive in some way, shape, or form. So, what can listening do? So this kind of third-ear listening that I've described can be data from mental models and can help us change our mental models. So when it comes to understanding the business, right, instead of looking at what are the trends that are coming, we can take more of a signal-based approach. So if you think of a submarine moving through the ocean, right, what's it doing? It's pinging constantly because it's sending out information and it's interpreting what it's getting back. Right? And it's separating out the signal from the noise and focusing on what's most important to the success of that submarine moving forward. And that is one way that we can use listening to help us better align and harmonize ourselves with the business environment. And a type of listening that I encourage and I talk about is listening to events, not just a conversation. So what are the things that are occurring? What is the pattern of events that are occurring? How do they build on one another? And what kind of world does that describe? Because, for example, if you recognize something as being a new idea, right, as what happened in tablets in 1971, 40 years ago, when Alan Kay wrote one of the first pieces on the inevitability of a tablet computer, and then you tracked over time, right, the product introductions, joint ventures, failures, and all of that. When the iPad was introduced, you would have had a much better perspective on what it meant and what your strategic options are than saying all of a sudden, what's my iPad strategy? When it comes to understanding people, it really means listening with the third ear to understand the relationships and the meaning of the communications that people are talking about. We saw this in the Hennessy example, but Kraft did a beautiful study, many of you I'm sure are familiar with it, about shopping during the height of the recession. And what they discovered was not just that people were freaking out, but rather that people went through a process. Just like there are stages of grief, there's processes of dealing with a recession, where people first were retrenching, then scrimping, but then seeing that they were being successful in adapting to these changed circumstances, and then bright-siding. And as people move through those different stages, there are different implications for how we communicate the brands, how we position the brands, even how we distribute and package the brands, recipes that we recommend, website content, and things like that. And so by really getting at the relationships, the meaning, and the processes, and getting away from that sort of two-way communication we saw earlier, brands can really help themselves understand people and convert that into marketing strategy. When it comes to advertising, I have emotions up here, but I also mean to include neural processing. Because, for example, Interscope, which is a company that does biometric analysis, when they did an analysis of Super Bowl advertising from, I think, 2008, what they discovered was that the ads that had the strongest emotional response were the ads that were most directly related to the economy and people's personal situations. It wasn't the soda, and it wasn't the other ones that scored extremely well. But what they were able to detect was people's emotional state and outlook in a silent way, right? That advertisers could learn from, right? Much different from what you learn from the typical measures of advertising effectiveness. And things like neural processing, there's some really interesting work being done, such companies like Neuro Insight out of Australia, where they look to see when people watch advertising, what is being stored in long-term memory, what they call the iconic triggers, and what's being put into short-term memory. And they use, as many people do, they use a model of memory called reconstructive memory, the idea being simply that we don't remember everything verbatim, that we have these iconic triggers, we recall them, and then we reconstruct the ad or the experience. So when it comes to thinking about advertising in this world of social communication, one of the implications is that we can get away from thinking about advertising as time and space, and we could think about actually putting these emotional triggers into communications and then having that trigger off a reconstructive process in people's minds and moving away from, advertising is clutter, advertising is more messaging, but actually working with people's working with people's memory process to trigger communications that can be reinforcing and persuading and educational. So, and then the last one has to do with using listening to create value throughout the entire enterprise. And here, it really means moving from an internal focus that we almost always have to really focused on our customers and our stakeholders and bringing all of their perspectives to bear. Eventually, it means if we can do that, that we can furnish, the right offering or the right experience to the right person at the right time, and enable all of our stakeholders to achieve their objectives. So, how can we use listening to help us challenge our mental models? Here are some questions that you can use to start. First, make the ones that you're using explicit. A lot of us operate with mental models that we were not even aware of. Second, what can you do to test your models and challenge them? Because it's like an experiment that you do. You've got a model, test it. Does it hold? Does it not hold? What would be a better explanation if it doesn't hold and things? How does it need to change? And then if you want to change your model, like say you wanted to move away from time and space advertising, what would it really take to do that? And what small changes can you then bring about so that you can have some quick wins and start to provide that experience and evidence that people need to really change their minds. So if we do all of this, and this is why this third year listening is humanistic, is because it's really concerned with human interest, values, and dignity. It's not so much about listening to the words, tracking phrases, and so forth, but it really means getting really true insight and understanding of people, bringing that into the brands, and acting upon that. And so this emergent humanism that we can all benefit from, it's grounded in listening with the third ear. It brings people into the brand, and if we do it well, it's a prospect for future and sustained business success. And with that, I'll close my comments and open it to questions if we have time. If not, I'll hang on.